Well, there is we've just been through the process of advertising and putting the PD together in an updated way. And it's interesting because I started with the PD that I applied for 10 years ago and expanded that a little, but the original PD was pretty good. I mean, the thing about the role inside government is it is the role of an advocate. More than anything else, it's an advocacy role. It's not a design office. We don't have programs that we run. We're not frontline staff. It's a very political role, but it's also a policy role. But it's what you can make of it inside the networks of government, and that was a bit of a challenge for me in the early days, not having any networks inside government. But I think that is the thing for people to understand, that it's an opportunistic role. You have to source where things might be happening, and then you've got to navigate yourself into those rooms, if you can, in time, to be able to have an influence on projects at the earliest possible time, because, as we all know, the later you get involved with a project, the harder it is to have any meaningful input to them, because there will be resistance and pushback. People are invested in whatever has happened. So our most successful things have been where we've been able to be there very early, or motivate something to happen where we've actually led the charge. But we're leading the charge back to the profession. We're not there to design it, we're there to ensure it is well designed. And that's a big challenge inside government anyway, because government doesn't often understand the value of design. There's lip service given to it a lot, but a great many public servants, ministers and senior government staff haven't really got a proper design understanding. Yes, I've given that a bit of thought before coming here this morning, and 10 years is a long time, and in some ways I think, oh, that's a pretty short list, we haven't done much, but in reality, some of these projects go over a long period of time. For example, the very first thing I did when I was appointed was take up the mantle from my predecessor, Philip Folland, who had established a competition after the 2011 floods. There's some money came through from the federal government to repair the city's ferry terminals. And Philip had set up a structure for a competition, and he and I swapped over as that competition was about to get going. So the first thing I did was sit on the judging panel for what has turned out to be the 8 very interesting ferry terminals that the city has now built and has operated now for quite some time, 4 or 5 years now. And so that's taken most of a 10-year cycle to get that competition done, navigate it through the very tortuous process of procurement, particularly as it was handed over to the City Council, which makes it even more complex. Then get them built and operational, and I think it was a very good solution. It was a very interesting, very creative design outcome for the city. It's nothing like it anywhere in the world in a sort of river type setting. And so that was the very first thing that we did. And I'm finishing with the new performing arts venue, which
another competition.
Was a competition that came out of the blue, really. I mean, Treasury had allocated some money years ago to a business case that got plucked out of the air, and suddenly, we're getting a new theatre. Well, I'm sure John Kotsis had been advocating for a long time, but we got in on day one on that, because I happened to be in the right place at the right time to say we would write the brief. That was my office. So we did, we wrote the brief. We conducted the competition, we selected a winner. It is quite a bold project for that site. A lot of complications on that site. The theatre is technically too big for the site, and we were able to find a solution in the competition phase on how to get a little bit more space for the designers, which we knew they would need. So that was, and that project's in construction. I'll have to wait another couple of years to go and see that. But the bulk of the work we did in writing the brief and advocating it for it right through government, when these competitions come in, and you make a selection, but the successful proponent doesn't know that they've won it. The person who advocates for it is the government architect internally, and I presented the Snowhead Blight Brainer scheme right through all the layers of the approval, right up to the Premier herself, as the advocate for the successful scheme. So internally we were making the case for this particular project. And it was very interesting on that one. I had previously chaired the Premier's Roundtable for the Conservation Management Plan for the whole of QPAC, which you may recall was nominated for heritage status during my time, and it was awarded heritage status, and then a CMP was done by Conrad Gargett, and it needed to be officially signed off. The Sydney Opera House has got a CMP, it's never been actually officially signed off. It's a very big, complex document, but it's never had formal assent. We thought it was important to get that assent, and the Premier set up this structure, and we had a very good panel on that. We had a very eminent panel, and we navigated that through, and in it, part of the recommendations was the establishment of an independent advisory panel which would look at all project work inside the QPAC heritage boundary. We've done 10 projects now. You tend not to think that there's much going on that side, but there's stuff happening always on that side, all over the place. The last one we did was the new central energy plant, which was a really good exercise in rolling our sleeves up with the designers, who were very keen to engage with the panel in a very proactive way. And so all those sort of things have been, there's continuity, and there's a built-in continuity now for the government architect's role. But some of the other major things, of course, the Brisbane strategy, I think, is the best piece of work that we did in my time, and it's still a highly relevant piece of work, probably more so if Brisbane is to be an Olympic city, which it looks like it will be. The Brisbane strategy, which is now in the State Library and is accessible, took a little while to achieve that, is an important document, a discussion document, which had input from a great many people from a great many backgrounds about what the city's about and what it should be. And so that document is there now to foster some important urban conversation going forward. And Q Design, of course, which is it's a disarmingly simple document. Disarmingly simple documents take years to navigate through government as policy. And in a format that's not like a government handbook. Just getting an approval to produce a book that looks like a design book is almost impossible inside government because it doesn't meet the comms guidelines. It took years negotiating that. It's a good document. It's been adopted by local government. Within government policy has been written and referencing it increasingly over time. It's 3 years old now since it was launched, and I'd say it's 3 years more influential. And it's not a document that will have a use-by date. I mean, all the principles are permanent principles, and we're getting some of the companion documents we're working on now in sub-areas like heritage or walking or social housing. I mean, there are other bits of work that's happening. So, I mean, they are some of the really important things we did. And probably the other biggest project was the social housing competition we ran, the Density and Diversity Done Well competition of 5 years ago now. Very interesting response to that competition, some really interesting work put up. We've now got 7 built. The very first one that's nearly finished is on the Gold Coast. Anna Gorman's very, very lovely project at Kebra Park is, I think, finishing, if it finished perhaps this week. An excellent small-scale project, which is an exemplar for future projects of all sorts of scale all over the state. So that piece of work has engaged procurement, it's engaged policy, it's engaged entrenched attitudes to social housing, it's engaged pushback from parts of government that don't like to do anything differently to the way they've always done them. That couldn't have happened without strong advocacy from a couple of people in my office in particular. And it's got years to run. So one of the big challenges of government, particularly capital works processes, is that many of these decisions are made in the agencies that run those projects. So the example you give of the two new inner city high schools, they weren't competitions, but they were quite detailed expressions of interest and credibility submissions from a number of prominent design offices around town. Our role in that one was to run some early, particularly for the Fortitude Valley School, which was the first one. We actually got education to contemplate the brief in more detail. We ran some inquiry by design workshops, which weren't run by our office, but were motivated by us, and we were in attendance, obviously. And we were on the selection panel for who ended up with the jobs, and that is quite troublesome sometimes, because there are entrenched networks inside government that often don't ask the right questions at the right time. So our role is to come in and ask those questions, and sometimes they're uncomfortable. Why are you selecting this group of people to be on a shortlist, for instance? The end result has been very good. I think we were definitely influential in the appointment of consultants to both those projects. And both projects, even though the complexities of government wanting to re-tender things they've already tendered at every phase, which we've been resisting and trying to change so that it's not wasteful for the profession and it's not duplication for officers who've already won the job to have to pitch for it again. It's very difficult. Government doesn't think that way. They're always thinking around that phase of the project and how can we make sure that we have done the fairest thing by the public dollar, etc. But in reality, often that is not a very efficient way to design buildings and have them delivered. So that's an ongoing conversation. We haven't won that one, we haven't lost it. It's a project by project argument. But from our office's point of view, we know if we can get the right consultant appointed, we haven't got to worry anymore, because we know that there's some very good design firms in the city, and some firms are appropriate for certain sorts of work and others for different parts of the sector. As long as you've got someone who's appropriately qualified and got a proper fee, then we can move on to the next project knowing that one will be looked after by the profession. But really, it's a song and dance routine for us all the time. Getting into the room first up is important, and then making sure that it's followed through in a sensible way. So, but those two schools are finished now. I'm not sure if the Southside ones must be nearly finished. That's looking very good. They're flagship projects for the government, and I noticed in the budget 2 days ago they've announced another 10. So that's very good. That's an interesting one. Design review nationally. We have a government architects network, and we sort of get together and talk about all the sort of common issues we have. And design review nationally is, of course, a big deal. Victoria has always had a strong design review panel, and they've done hundreds of projects all around Victoria. They have a very formal process for doing it, requirements to submit a certain amount, and come in and pin it up and talk to it, and then a panel that reviews it. And New South Wales I'm on the New South Wales Design Review panel. They're a little bit more relaxed, but they try and involve a lot of design review into capital works. We found here, when I came into the role, it was called the Board for Urban Places, and for various reasons of various changes of government, it lost its way and ended up with nobody in it except me. And we were able to reconstitute it as the Urban Design and Places panel and build it back up again, and it's got 30, the last iteration, we've got 30 members in it, and we draw a specific group together for any particular project that we're looking at. And we're increasingly finding we've done about 4 or 5 major hospitals in the last 12 months, really, really important projects. But they're not projects that you can come in for an hour and a half and pin them up for 40 minutes and then have a chat and then walk out with the answer. I mean, they're just too complex, those projects. And I was making this point to the other government architects just last week, that my feeling is design review is not ideally done in just a set little time frame. Where it works best is where you have continuity of review. So you set up a panel, and you might set up the first design review in a formal way, but stay involved. Keep those people in the project conversation and have the project proponents come back and show you what they've done and go to the next phase and contribute as an informed team member, really. So Queen's Wharf is an interesting example. I mean, it's a massive project. I've been on it for 8 years. Now, my knowledge of that project will walk out the door with me, really, because you can't swap that 8 years. Most of the design decisions, I guess, are made, but there's future stages still to happen, and it's a very, very big project. Now, we set up a standing Urban Design Places panel subcommittee for that, and it met for many years, and with fierce resistance, I might say, from the project proponents. Often there was a very testy meetings early days in that project. We had some influence. It's all very well me saying, well, it's better than it was going to be, but it's true. I mean, we have had an influence on that project, which I think will deliver a major project for the city, big footprint project that has to do important things in terms of city networks and urban engagement and connections across the river and internally a whole precinct of the city that is changing dramatically from being almost completely unknown to the public to being one that the public can have a lot of access to. So really these projects are slow and they need continuity. Let me give you a simple example of that. We've been involved with, again, a lot of very tense negotiations, if you like, with the Brisbane Metro project. And one of the issues, just one of many, many issues on that project, is Victoria Bridge. And Victoria Bridge is the only major kind of link from the centre of the city to the South Bank. There will be a new bridge at the casino, but it's not in the main drag of things. And the other two bridges, which are relatively, widely spaced away, you've got the Goodwill Bridge, which is a relatively new bridge, and the old William Jolly Bridge. And it's the Kurilpa Bridge. But they're both relatively new, and they're not in the main space. Victoria Bridge is still the main spine for the city. Its pedestrian amenity is atrocious. And to me, it was the most obvious thing in the world that's the first thing you would fix. But it wasn't obvious in the project process, as we soon learnt, because the dominant features of that project were buses and new rolling stock and engineering factors and, how to run a network system and all these things. And every time we'd go to meetings to say, but, we need, the pedestrian amenity needs to be upgraded. And we just talk to the hand. It was really, and it has been until very recently, very, very hard work getting a real focus on the peripheral matters. Still quite a lot of challenges on that project when it lands in the Performing Arts Precinct, and you try and integrate bikeways and pedestrians and people on public transport and a relatively narrow carriageway. It's not over yet, but keeping those kind of issues, people don't often realise. People will adapt. You give them a 600 mil walkway, they'll squeeze down it somehow or other and go past someone on a bike coming the other way. But if you give them a 5 metre walkway, then they'll obviously move more comfortable and will naturally use it more often, but they won't be able to perhaps vocalise why they found that to be so much better. And that's the role that a public realm analysis is essential for all these projects that happen.
Yes, I'm trying to imagine that area now, which sits between two of our most important public buildings in one of our greatest tourist attractions, not being covered by several hundred metres of pool fencing just to keep pedestrians safe?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting comment. In fact, just as I was sitting in the car this morning, a text came through from somebody about the fact that the City Council have just announced that they are putting back on the table the idea of undergrounding that station. If Brisbane's seriously going to be an Olympic city, then that station will not be adequate, and we know it won't be. And we've been strongly supportive of the undergrounding in that location, but we've been not supportive of the form in which it was being proposed. So there's a chance that that will be back on the agenda. The Olympics will be a fantastic motivating force for good or ill. We hope for good in the public realm for the city. There's some really interesting legacy opportunities for the city to bring things together that normally they don't get the level of focus, and they certainly don't get the funding. So we've got 11 years, we might have some very interesting revisiting of some of these things over the next 5 years at least. Queensland is a big state, and it's taken me all my professional life. I didn't come here till 1981, and I think I've now travelled every bit of the highway from the Tweed to Cooktown at various times, with project work that I've been involved with. But it's a very unusual state, Queensland, because it's so decentralised, because it's got major urban centres right up the coast, and they have their own culture, they have their own histories. They're often very fine CBDs. Look at a place like Rockhampton, magnificent CBD. And yet you find decisions made in regional centres are often against their long-term interests, particularly the location of regional universities, which are major economic generators, and then they pick them up and move them into a field, 20 k's out of town, and wonder why nobody wants to go there, or it doesn't contribute to the local economy in the way that it should. So these kind of decisions we like to be involved in. It's easy to say, of course we'd like to be involved. How do you get involved, and how do you make the role be seen as a place where you actually get asked your opinion early enough on some of these things? But the growth question, what's my advice? Well, for Brisbane, I think the biggest challenge is governance. There is a constant arm wrestle between the state government and the city council over the same patch, and that's because the city council is so big, and because the state government owns most huge tracts of land inside the council's bailiwick. And they both have a strong interest, but from differing points of view. And I've watched over the years, it doesn't matter who the politics are represented by, whether they're one side or the other or opposite sides, they never get on. And it's a function of the structure of the governance of the place. And I really think it's a really hard one to put on the table, but I think it should be on the table, that we really need to rethink the governance of certainly the inner 5Ks of Brisbane. How do you do that? Well, I think the asset that you start with is the river, the Maiwar. This is a river city. Its greatest asset is the river, yet really nobody runs it. The river is kind of the orphan, even though it's the asset. I think you need a structure that can embrace the river in its context, which means that you need a common view. And I think if you set up a new structure for the inner 5K that was jointly sponsored by the city and the state for their mutual interest and benefit, I think that will go a long way to addressing some of these governance problems. And that's where the bulk of the action is. It's not the CBD, but there's a lot of land in the inner 5K. A lot of things happening in there. All the institutions are there, and the recreation, lots of things. So Brisbane is a big, low-density city. It has enormous potential to build well within its low-density footprint. It's got a good rail system, it'll have a better rail system. It's got a good bus system, it'll have a better bus system. But we are not so good at urban density planning and management of our assets. And if we can get rid of the turf wars, then I think that would be a great benefit for the city. Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, you reach an age that you don't want to reach sooner than you plan to reach it. And I'll go back to my practice, which I've always kept running. But I'm not going to retire to the back garden. I've got a number of things that I'd like to continue an involvement with. And I'm hopeful that in a different setting, I can voice things slightly differently than the way you can inside government. You are reasonably restricted inside government on what you can say. I've had the benefit of being chair of Open House for all these years, that in that role I've been able to make public statements about things that is a little bit outside the norm. Normally it's only the minister who can talk about the kind of issues in my portfolio, but managed to navigate a bit of freedom in that space over the years. I am keen to take a bit more of a profile on some of these urban matters, particularly without the constraints of government, and I'm hoping I can make a contribution in that space, at least for a few more years to come.
I'm sure you will. Malcolm Middleton, thank you for your time.
Michael, thank you.